So not too long ago, skill-based matchmaking was removed in pretty much every Crucible mode in Destiny. And I wanted to make a video about it and talk about, my perspective and my opinion on it. The whole skill-based versus connection-based matchmaking thing is kind of old news at this point. I think pretty much everyone said everything that they were going to say about it, like back when it was more recent. I didn't, because I've been busy not making videos for a month. But a lot of the dialogue around it has kind of cooled down recently. I have some thoughts about the whole thing that I wanted to share, even though it's kind of old news, because there are things that I think people haven't really talked about. There are certain perspectives and details about the different changes that I think get overlooked depending on whether or not you're in the super hardcore, try to win every game like hardcore type of player, or if you're in the category where you just kind of play casually, or maybe you don't even play at all. Okay, so first things first, I want to define a couple of things, like moving forward. I think a lot of people probably they either already know exactly the stuff that I'm going to say, or they know some of what I'm going to say, and they haven't really considered like the rest of it, depending on which player group you're in. But I just want to do my due diligence and get these kind of definitions defined before I get into like some of my actual criticisms and suggestions. We have to define who plays the game, because you can't make balancing decisions about your game if you don't understand like who is intended to be playing it, or in this case, who kind of is playing it. In this scenario, like in this topic, the player base is defined on a couple of different axes. It has multiple variables that can be used to define a player. The first variable is whether or not you are a high skill player or a low skill player. Whether or not you're a high or a low skill player is actually really hard to nail down because it changes over time. Pretty much everyone starts out as a low skill player. And then, depending on other things, you may or may not become a higher skill player than you were before. And then if you leave the game for a while and you come back later, you will probably be a little bit lower skill than you were before. Depends on your personality, depends on what other types of games you were playing in the meantime. Depends on how hard you work to earn that muscle memory. So every player is a little bit different. Every player's skill is fluid. And on top of that, it's really hard to define. I can't describe what the definition of skill is in terms of Destiny, and I don't think anyone can. A lot of people will list components of what skill is. You might say that being able to accurately aim is like a major defining part of skill, but like so is movement, and so is map knowledge, so is your loadout, so is the kind of like pre-game stuff that like isn't active, Twitch-based muscle memory. All of that applies to skill. Now, as far as like average player skill or the spectrum of different skill brackets in Destiny, I don't have a whole lot of like solid data. I mean, like I assume Bungie has the data, but I don't think they have it accessible in any kind of public-facing, like easily accessible chart. I know that you can pull data like daily or hourly or whatever it is from their API, but it's a very like high-level view. You can't look and find the actual like player like individual player skill level and then keep track of like this. I don't think that they have that level of detail, and even if they do, I don't think that anyone has been tracking it for like long enough for what I was hoping to find. So the best that I could find, I think, was DestinyTracker.com's data. They have data for a couple of different game types. So like I'm going to use stats for Control and stats for Trials, just because like I think those two game modes are the two most common game modes within the player base. Like they represent like your casual, I just want to play Crucible, whatever game mode type, like the quick play playlist, and then your super hardcore, like, I want to play Trials type people. I think that they're as good a data point as we're going to get. The point though is that this is third-party data. Destiny Tracker is a third party, so, take all of their data I'm going to show you with a grain of salt, obviously. Also, this data is only for this season. So this season is like a third of the way, half over, or something like that. I couldn't find a good way to find old data, so like this data is not only third party and not only not exact, and on top of that, it's like a limited data set. It's only the more recent game, some of which includes data from after the change. So it's not it's not the cleanest data, but I think it will serve my purposes for this video just fine. So your player skill ends up on a chart somewhere. So on this end you have, low skill players, and then all the way over here you have high skill players. If you look at it, most people are in this, lower skill section of the chart. Like, this is our main people who are playing Crucible are in the low section. And then it falls off. And then you get a bump in the high skill section. The reason that I think the chart looks this way, with 2 bumps, is that I think that if you're good enough to be good enough, to be considered like average or whatever, you're probably good enough and motivated enough to get even better. I think the reason that we see two bumps in the bell curve at either end is because there's not a lot of people who are motivated to get better, but who can't progress into the top tier section. Like, no one's getting stuck in the middle. They're either playing to get good and they get good, or they're just playing casually and they end up, in the low skill section. They never make it very far. Obviously, everyone is going to have a sort of a soft limit, depending on how often you play, or your own kind of mental predisposition or things like that. Everyone is going to have a point where they struggle to get past that. And then as you get into the higher sections, less and less and less people are going to be able to make it over that roadblock. But I think that this small bump over here demonstrates that most people who are trying are capable of getting past that. Like, no one who's good enough to be here is incapable of making the small leap to get to the very end. So I've showed you this chart. This chart that I've been talking about is the chart for control. This chart is trials. And you'll notice at first they look very similar, but if we kind of line them up and analyze them side by side, you'll notice that in the trials data, there are more high skill players, percentage-wise, than there are in the control list. And what I think this can show us is that there are different populations in different game modes of Destiny. And that makes intuitive sense. The people who are in trials are the people who are trying to be, really good. So the populations are very similar, which is interesting, but there is a difference. It's a very small difference, but you can see it, and it makes intuitive sense why it's there. The last thing I want to talk about with these charts, before I kind of put them away and move on, is that the average player definitely skews more towards the low skill end of the bracket. I think a lot of people assumed that. We see a lot of high skill players. All of the people who are streaming Destiny on the daily are probably, at least on the higher skill side of the graph. And they get a lot of attention and a lot of views, because they have a platform. But I think everyone understands that there are only so many of these, high skill people that make a name for themselves. And the population of players that play Destiny is so huge that there are just, this group of streamers basically isn't representative of the Destiny population. So, and I think these charts support this. A lot of people are in the low end. Destiny's, main average player is going to be on the low skill end. Even the people who play in trials, who play more, competitive game modes. The other thing that's worth mentioning before we move on is that it's very difficult for a player to move around on the player skill spectrum. I know I said earlier that player skill is kind of fluid and it changes a lot. When I said that, I meant over long periods of time. But in terms of week to week or game to game data, your player skill is probably going to be exactly where it is. It's very difficult for a player to suddenly surpass the skill level that they're at. it's very difficult to just sit down and play the game and like focus in and then just instantly be better at the game. You can't just learn map layout by trying harder. You know what I mean? If you don't have muscle memory for certain movement options, you aren't going to just intuitively suddenly be able to perform them because you are in the zone or whatever. It's very difficult to like overcome that because it's a very objective kind of physical skill that you have to do. And then at the same time, a lot of those skills end up being muscle memory. So it's very difficult to just turn off your ability to understand, you know, where snipers are going to be at or like how to look at your radar. You know what I mean? So in both directions, player skill on a match-to-match or week-to-week, you know, time scale is not going to change very much. You pretty much are whatever skill you are. So that's skill level. I want to talk about the other component to this chart. So we've been talking about it in terms of a one-dimensional player. Either they are low skill or they're high skill. There is actually another dimension to this chart, and that's whether or not you're a casual player or a hardcore player. Now this, unlike skill, is a mentality. It's a style of playing. It's an in your brain kind of thing, and it does vary match to match. This variable depends on the intent of the player and nothing else. It has nothing to do with what gear you use or how good you are or how well you perform or whether or not you like elimination or big team fights. Or it only has to do with your intention. Whether or not you care about winning, whether or not you care about achieving the things that the playlist gives you, like whatever loot it is, or if it's some kind of Crucible pinnacle. It's about mentality and intent. The mentality of a player changes based on all kinds of things. Like, if you're just in a bad mood one day, you might be more likely to be in a hardcore mood. Depending on who you are, if you're having a bad day, you might just say, yeah, I don't even care. I don't care anymore. And you might play with a more casual mentality. It might depend on who you're playing with. You know, if you join a group with a bunch of friends and your friends are very hardcore, you're likely to adopt their mentality or they might adopt yours. It depends on the current game incentives or the game mode that you're playing. If the game is incentivizing you to perform well and you care about whatever loot it is that they're gonna, you know, they're telling you that you can have if you perform well, you're more likely to want to perform well. But if you're playing Gambit and you already have the Dredgen title and you, you know, and it's just, you know, it's whatever, then you're probably not gonna want to play that hardcore. Like, it won't be a big deal to you if you lose. Incentive isn't always baked into the game, although that's a large component of it. A lot of people who play Crucible, you know, competitively, for example, care a lot about their stats. So you might not want to ever play casually because that would harm your stats in whatever playlist you care about. That's another form of incentive, even if it's not one that Bungie is specifically offering you in the form of loot. So based on all that, this section of the chart is going to be way more fluid on shorter timescales than the other part. People are going to move around a lot more. Some people only like to play one type of Crucible, and they play that type of Crucible very competitively, and they only play with meta weapons, and that is their only speed all the time, and that's fine. If that's how they play the game, that's cool. They exist, they're just not very common. At the same time, there are some people who, like, they move around really erratically. I think those people are also kind of uncommon. I know personally, even if there are no incentives, and even if I'm playing with people who, you know, basically don't care, I feel bad when I perform badly. It's very difficult for me to get into that kind of casual mindset. So I think I already said this, but game incentive affects player intent. So, like, a game that rewards you significantly more for wins and rewards you less for, or not at all, for loses, is more likely to get people to play with a hardcore attitude. If a game gives identical rewards for wins and losses, and it literally does not matter, you just get a participation reward, people are more likely to be willing to play with a more casual attitude. So a game can separate these two populations, this casual population and this hardcore population. And they can separate them to a degree, but they usually will do it in the way that you see a separation between something like the Control playlist and the Trials playlist. You can expect a lot more hardcore people to be in the Trials playlist, because if you don't get wins, or if you don't get like enough wins in the Trials playlist, you basically don't get any reward. It's very unlikely that a casual player is going to spend a lot of time in that playlist. And at the same time, if you have a hardcore player who cares about loot and wants the incentives from Trials, they're not going to spend their weekends in Control. They're going to play Trials. It would be reasonable to assume that these two different variables tend to correlate with each other. It's very likely that the low skill end of the skill spectrum tends to correlate with the casual side of the intent spectrum, and that high skill tends to be more hardcore players. I think that's pretty obvious and intuitive to a lot of people, and I think that explains part of why the skill population is different in Trials and in Control. So it would be reasonable to assume that most high skill players are going to be playing with a high skill attitude, and most low skill players are going to be playing with a more casual attitude. Generally speaking, if a hardcore player is playing the game, they intend on getting better. And if they are hardcore enough and they work hard, they probably will get better. So generally speaking, that's probably how that correlation is going to go. That correlation will probably hold true most of the time, but there's obviously going to be, people who are different. Every top tier player is obviously not going to want to play at 1,000 miles per hour every single game. That's actually one of their major criticisms about skill-based versus connection-based matchmaking, is that they feel like every game is a sweat fest. And I get that. That's going to be stressful, especially when you want to just sit down and play a casual game. At the same time, low skill players are going to get competitive and they're going to complain about losing. But they're not going to be going to Destiny Tracker and checking their elo, and they're not going to play Trials every weekend. There's going to be some overlap between, the opposite ends of these two spectrums, but it's going to be very small, I think. Okay, so now let's talk about what skill-based matchmaking and connection-based matchmaking actually are. Skill-based matchmaking is actually a misnomer. It doesn't exist. There is no such thing as skill-based matchmaking. There's only performance-based matchmaking. And performance is affected by all kinds of things, like teammates, matchups, loadouts, and other variables that are other than your pure game skill. Most stat tracking sites like Destiny Tracker use some form of elo ranking. Losing matches lowers your elo, and winning matches increases it. And the amount it shifts changes depending on how likely you were to win that game or not. Skill-based matchmaking ideally tries to find groups of players who are the same elo or same skill to put in the same game. Connection-based matchmaking, as the name suggests, matches you based on your connection. Lots of things affect your connection performance, but latency is probably the most common. And that means that physical distance between players is one of the biggest things that will affect your connection-based matchmaking score, or whatever it is. You just physically can't make the data go faster from place to place. There's going to be a delay between when you tell your character to do something and when that player in Canada or in Japan or wherever sees your input. So connection-based matchmaking isn't exactly, but it tends to be region-based matchmaking. That's neither here nor there. It just kind of is. Connection-based matchmaking doesn't improve everyone's connection or everyone's experience in the game across the board. It only allows people who have good connections to benefit from those connections. Destiny uses a favor the shooter style connection system, meaning that if you land a hit on an opponent on your screen, then you landed the hit no matter what. It doesn't matter if on the opponent's screen they were already behind cover. They got hit anyway because you were looking at data that was like further back in time. They may have on their screen visibly moved behind cover, but if that movement hasn't reached the server or the peer-to-peer whatever and actually gotten to you, then as far as your client is concerned, they're not behind cover. This has tons of pros and cons. It's the reason for a lot of trades that happen in Destiny. But this means that sometimes certain engagements can feel really unfair. This will not solve that problem. It will just mean that people who have really fast connections are more often going to get matched together. If you personally have a slow connection, you're not going to benefit from this in pretty much any way. You will probably match up against other people who also have bad connections, but that isn't necessarily a bad thing. Having a favor-the-shooter system, though, is really important because without favor-the-shooter networking, you would have to predict how far in the future your opponents are. So you'd see your opponent running around, and you would have to shoot ahead of them, so that by the time your client sends your shot data to them, they are now in that spot to check whether or not you got hit. So a favor the victim system would mean that the shooter would have to lead their target. But the amount that you lead your target depends on how much lag that other person has. And that amount of lag can not only change player to player, but it can change minute to minute in the game. Personally, I think that favor the shooter is fine. There's really no way around. The only other way to do it would be to just stop the game every time someone lags and run the game. That would never work for a first-person shooter. I think this is the right way to do it, but it's good to be aware of the limits and the kind of symptoms of this kind of thing. The main result of a favor-the-shooter system is that people with high latency will often trade with people rather than only one of the two people securing the kill. High-skill, low-latency players are going to benefit from this system in a connection-based matchmaking scenario because winning a gunfight results in a trade less often. So let's say two people are sniping each other down the same lane. If you're a high-skill, low-latency player and they also have low latency, the chances of you killing them first and then them getting to kill you before their client has registered that they've died are very low because the two of you have very low latency. So this benefits the player in that engagement that has the highest skill because they will more often win the gunfight and not have to have a trade with the lower skill person. Low skill, low latency players in that same scenario are obviously more likely to lose because latency is no longer an issue and you're relying on a pure skill-based interaction. I want to talk a little bit more about matchmaking thresholds. When the game finds matches for a Crucible game, it obviously isn't going to say no to a match if you're not exactly the same criteria. There has to be a little bit of a threshold. In connection-based matchmaking, your ping can change second to second. So measuring that and then having a really narrow margin for matchmaking obviously isn't going to work very well. And measuring objective skill is just very difficult in general to do accurately. So, matching people based on very, very tight criteria is going to be, very difficult in the first place just because of the wide range of skill, and it might not even be fair because you might be measured a skill that isn't exactly right. So it's good and necessary to have a little bit of error room in there. But at the same time, it probably won't match you with people who are really different. Like that threshold can't be too big because if it's matching high and low skill players or low latency and high latency players, depending on the matchmaking type, if people from opposite ends of the spectrum are matching together, that defeats the entire purpose of the matchmaking in general. At that point, you just have random matchmaking. The thing to remember, though, is that these thresholds are completely arbitrary, and they're defined by Bungie. Bungie can choose to make them as strict or as large and loose as they want. It's literally just a number in the code. They could type in whatever number, whatever value they wanted for the maximum threshold, and then that would just be it. So now that we've agreed that the average player in Destiny is probably going to be a relatively low skill and therefore a casual player, let's talk about the target demographic for the game and playlist identity. The target demographic of a game is not always the demographic that plays the game. A game can position itself as a specific type of game. The devs will decide hey, we want to make a game that's for this type of player. And then those players may never play the game. Your game may get filled with like casual people who don't understand why, your game does things a certain way, but they like a different aspect of it, and that's why they come back and they play it. At that point, as a developer, you have a choice. You can either adapt and change your target demographic and appeal to these new players, or you can stick to your guns and say, no, our game is for this type of player, and we're going to make decisions assuming that player is playing. Maybe that's good for the game. Maybe that will attract the player you're looking for. Maybe it won't, and maybe the casuals that liked your game, who were the only ones who were playing, will leave. That's just a decision that every game developer has to make for themselves. So, just as an example, a game that is intended to be a highly competitive hardcore shooter might very well implement harsh mechanics, even if 90% of the players are casuals. That game isn't meant for those casual players. No one asked them to play the game, assuming the game was advertised correctly. If you assume that the game's advertising was honest and it was clearly communicating that it was looking for people who wanted a hardcore experience, those players have no one to blame but themselves for playing this game that may or may not be what they enjoy as a game. If that's the scenario you're looking at, then if the players are unhappy, then that's just kind of, their own fault. You might be able to argue that the devs should stick to their vision. That there's a certain amount of integrity to be had for saying, nope, this is the way our game is going to be. At the same time, if a game did advertise to casuals, even if it is a hardcore game, like if it lied to consumers, it may have a responsibility to cater to them, no matter how much the devs wish it were a hardcore game. It all depends on how the game is marketed. If you look at Destiny tries to cater to literally every kind of player. You want PvE? We got that. You want PvP? We got that. Hardcore, casual, doesn't matter. Come play our game. Come spend money in the Eververse. The game has always tried to be accessible to casual players, but at the same time, they've always made sure that there's some amount of pinnacle content that is reserved for hardcore players to give them something to do. There's a lot of players in Destiny who have probably never completed a raid or a dungeon or whatever the hardcore game mode of the season is. Bungie knows that some people like me and like a lot of other people will never complete these activities, and that's okay. They understand that a bunch of loot will never be used by a large percentage of their population, and that's just one of the costs of building a game that has something for everyone, including hardcore players. Bungie should continue to cater to as many groups as they can. That's their philosophy. I don't think they should change it. Destiny has been advertised and has been communicated as a game that is for everyone, and they should stick to that. If push comes to shove, they may have to make a choice, but if they don't have to choose, they should try and implement solutions that work for everyone. Before I start describing what I think Bungie should do and giving some of my personal opinionated hot takes, I just want to point out that when skill-based matchmaking was the way Crucible was done, Bungie wasn't catering to everyone. They still aren't catering to everyone now with connection-based matchmaking. There's an argument to be made that one is better than the other because it subjectively improves the game for more players depending on which group it applies to. But it's hard to say definitively because a lot of the data we have is really vague. But even if we had really clear data and we could make an obvious choice about which was better, it kind of doesn't matter. If Bungie has decided that their game should be a certain way, then it doesn't really matter which is objectively better because it's not our game. It's not clear to me, at least, whether or not Bungie has made that decision. So I think we can assume that they might be. There's a little bit of wiggle room here where we can still make changes without sacrificing their vision for the game. I think if Bungie had a solid choice in mind from the beginning, they'd have stuck with it. But they didn't. They changed it because everyone complained. So that says to me that Bungie hasn't made a choice. So I think there is still a compromise to be made. So before I start talking about what I think that Bungie should do, some changes that I want to see, I want to talk about some things that I've seen people say online that I don't agree with. I want to talk about some things that I think Bungie should not do. Some advice they should not consider. A lot of low-skill people online will complain about getting mercied and losing games over and over and over again. Now that skill-based matchmaking is gone. That is a fair complaint. If you hear people making that complaint and telling you that they are having this new experience and they do not like this experience, that's valid. You do not get to just dismiss their opinion. Those are players. They love that game just like you do. And the game is now different, and they like it less. It's a matter of opinion. That is a completely valid position to have. People will often respond to them online and say they should either play casually and ignore the score and just choose not to be upset about losing game after game, or play hardcore and get good and then win games. I reject this argument completely. I know I said this earlier, but I reject this argument completely in this context because it doesn't hold up when you consider the other half of the argument. If you flip the logic back towards the high skill players, who these low skill players are presumably complaining to, the high skill players constantly complain that their games are really hard and they have to work really hard to win since their opponents are so good under skill-based matchmaking. This is true, and that is also a valid complaint, but it's only true if you're playing to win. The logic given to low skill players that they should just choose to be casual or choose to get good is the same as telling a high skill player you should just choose to not care about the score. If your concern is that you have to play really hard every game, just choose not to play to win. If this argument bothers you, that means that you're a high skill player who is complaining about hard games, but you still want to win because you want easy, non-challenging winning games. That's also a valid position. It's just that it's the same position that the casual players want. They want to be able to play games that are quote-unquote easy, see here at their skill level. They want to be able to play games that they have a reasonable chance at winning without having to invest tons of time and effort to become the best at the game. It's the same logic. If you oppose their argument, then this argument is inherently hypocritical, and people should just stop making it. All of the positions, all of the experiences that I've described so far are valid experiences to have, but literally not a single one of them contradicts the other one. None of them are a reason to justify this position. This position is justifiable if you, it is possible to hold the position you should not care or you should get good. But it's impossible to hold that position and then say, as a high skill player, that skill-based matchmaking needs to go away because I want to have casual games. That position is possible to maintain, but it isn't possible to maintain while arguing that particular outcome. They don't mesh like that. Some people say the skill-based matchmaking is bad because it masks your true skill level, and sometimes it lets people stagnate and stop getting better. Whether or not this is even true is debatable, but we can ignore this argument without figuring out whether it's true, because the argument inherently assumes that people want or need to improve at this game. The fact is that they just don't. Some people like playing casually. I bet a lot of people like playing casually. Based on those stats that we looked at, pretty much everybody probably likes to play casually. By making this argument, you are saying that the Crucible is only for hardcore players. You're saying that the Crucible is only for players who have that hardcore mentality where they want to be the best and they have to always constantly be improving. That's just not what the whole Crucible is. Some parts of it are, but not all of it. I reject that principle entirely. Not every playlist should be trials. That's just not true. I see a lot of people who seem to think that enjoying winning or disliking losing is a hardcore mentality, or that a casual mentality means that you must ignore the score or the result. I reject this argument to a degree. There is an element of truth to this argument, but only barely. Like I mentioned in the beginning of the video, mentality has a lot to do with the stakes of the game, not just the score. You can play casually and still play to win. That's what every single casual pickup game of any sport is. When people play football at a family cookout or whatever it is social people do these days, or not even these, whatever. Whenever people at social gatherings play these casual games, they are still trying to win. If they weren't, then they wouldn't bother trying to score at all. Or they wouldn't even bother trying to catch passes. Like, what's the difference if you aren't paying to win? Why even play at all? Why even have teams? Why not just throw the ball around? It's a disingenuous argument. The idea that you have to ignore the score completely, or that like it has no bearing on the game at all, is a little bit of an extreme argument. It's disingenuous in the sense that it goes too far into an unrealistic degree of disconnection. The casual-hardcore dynamic is a sliding scale. There is no one version of casual gaming. Some people do just want to shoot things and don't care about the score at all. Those people play Mayhem Clash. At the same time, professional competitive sports almost always universally seed their tournament brackets so that teams are matched against teams of equivalent skill. The idea that the presence of a score makes it inherently competitive and that skill-based matchmaking inherently makes it casual is just not true. They can influence someone's opinion, their mentality, more often than not. But, like, they're not, like, universal, set-in-stone, objective truth. That's just not how that works. Okay, so if I were in charge, if I got to make all the choices and decide what would happen with the future of matchmaking in Destiny, this is probably what I would do. I would implement some sort of Crucible passage card or boon. They seem to be, like, this kind of mechanic seems to be pretty popular in Trials. It's been in pretty much every single version of Trials, and it's been a little bit different each time. People like being able to refine their experience and their rewards. I think that if you give players the ability to request specific types of matchmaking, then people will be much more accepting of skill-based matchmaking being removed as the default. People are mad right now that there is literally no way to play 6v6 the way that they had been up until this season. It's just gone. There just isn't another playlist that has skill-based matchmaking. A lot of them probably didn't quit Crucible completely now that the change has been made, though I bet a lot of them considered it. They're just mad that the option was taken away completely, wholesale. If they knew that they had an option to play it whenever they wanted, I think they'd be a lot happier and more willing to play connection-based matchmaking in the meantime. I envision a system where the Crucible might be connection-based by default, but Shaxx will sell you Crucible boons that modify your matchmaking conditions on an individual level. One boon might be a quick play boon, and it will match you with literally anyone to get you as fast a game as possible, as long as there's a lobby that would accept you in. Like, you would take this boon, and it would just say your connection options would be literally anyone. I do not care what their ping is, I do not care what their skill is, just put me in a game. Another boon might be some sort of casual card that will seed your games with easy opponents. Like, you would take this card, and it would intentionally put you against people who are worse than you. Another boon, on the flip side, might be a hardcore card that will seed your games with harder opponents in exchange for powerful and frequent loot. If you have those two boons together, then the hardcore players who want to get real good rewards for that week, and the casual players who just don't care and want to have fun shooting people, will seed each other's systems. And then those systems would also pull from the quick play card to fill in any gaps. You can have as many of these as you want if you were to revamp matchmaking to have more variables and have more types of conditions that you can match on an individual level. I don't currently know how the networking works for Destiny. This would obviously be a big overhaul, but if it were implemented, you could have, theoretically, as many of these as you want. You would just enter the matchmaking queue, and then you would have a list of conditions for different things that your client is willing to connect to, and then it would just look at the list of available lobbies, and then the lobbies themselves have entry conditions, and if your client finds a lobby that it accepts and that it accepts you, then you have a match. You don't need or even want a game to have only a single type of Crucible passage. It doesn't matter if some people are on hardcore and some people are on casual. Their game experiences will be different, but it doesn't matter because that's what they asked for. At the end of the day, this game is about giving all types of players an experience that they enjoy. Destiny is, like, by definition and by the admission of the developers, a game that has something for everyone. It isn't just a PvP game. It isn't just a PvE, like, 6-man raid game. Like the game is full of different experiences. And the idea that a Crucible game must only contain a certain type of experience is just wrong. You probably even agree with me, and you might not know it. If you think that connection-based matchmaking is a good thing, then you inherently must admit that a game that has players of different skill levels is okay, because that's what happens when there's connection-based matchmaking. The only thing that I'm suggesting is that we take that concession that there can be different experiences within one game, and we give players the ability to request a specific experience. As long as there are enough players, I think that it would work just fine. And then on top of that, if you're asking for easy games and they're just you're literally the worst player in the game and there's no one worse than you, well, what you do is you just say after a certain amount of time matchmaking, if no suitable matches are found for your trial card or for your Crucible card, just pause the card, don't consume it, and put them in a regular game with whatever matchmaking is available. At that point, the option is just don't play, or play the lesser version of what you asked for. There's obviously going to be some concessions that need to be made by pretty much every player sometimes. Another thing that I would add alongside this is I would add time-based criteria. I think that it is A, not hard, and B, beneficial to have a game system that increases the range of acceptable player matches that get made as time goes on if you are unable to find a match. There will always be a certain level of variation between players within a game because no sorting algorithm is perfect and you don't have infinite players to match with. Like, you're just going to run into issues. So there has to be a threshold, like I talked about before. You simply have to define the amount of variation that you're targeting. In the past, with skill-based matchmaking, the range was very tight, and that was what was causing a lot of pain for the hardcore players. If the range is too wide, then I think what you'll have is effectively connection-based matchmaking, which is what we have now. That's also causing a certain amount of pain for a different group of players. What you need to do is target a specific ideal level of variation within a game, and then somehow tune it to be, to figure out what that level is and nail it down. But then if you can't achieve it in 3 minutes or whatever it is, widen the scope. At that point, you have already failed the player in terms of not getting them a game. The next best thing you can do is just get them a game. Like literally anything. Any game would be better than no game. At least personally, I think. Another thing you could do is you could give them an option in that Crucible card I mentioned, and you could allow them to say, I do not want to widen my criteria. I'm willing to wait. Again, this is about player choice. If you give players choices, I think that A, they will be happier in general, and B, they will be more willing to accept the thing they thought they didn't want. Because they know in the back of their mind that they can choose to have the thing they said they want at any time. They just gotta go in, give Shaxx a little bit of glimmer, and get one of those cards. The last component to this matchmaking overhaul that I'm suggesting is that playlists get incentivized. One problem that you run into with making changes like this is that players just avoid playlists that they don't like. That's why Trials is the way it is. And that's why connection-based matchmaking 6v6 Classic Mix playlist was still full of sweaty, stacked teams and high-skill players, even though it had connection-based matchmaking. The reason for casual players not playing it could have been that the UI was not very good. It was kind of down in the bottom and like out of the way. But it also very well could have been that casual players would go into the playlist, get stomped, and then say, I don't like that at all, and then leave. Bungie has solved this problem for now by forcing everyone into that playlist whether they want to or not. But that's only going to do so much. You can't force players to play a game. Like, playing a game is a choice. If they're not having fun playing the game, they'll just stop. If you're going to have a playlist that players don't want to play, the least you could do is give them a reason to play it. So this is where another aspect of the Crucible passages I think really shines. They can have rewards associated with them to encourage players to actually use them. You could have several different types of passages, and then a larger weekly quest that asks you to play multiple different passages a week to encourage people to populate them all. If you give people a reason to play high skill and then low skill and then, to fill out all of these different hypothetical Crucible boon passages that I'm talking about, if you give them an incentive to, with rewards they care about, like powerful drops or whatever it is, then you may solve that problem of players avoiding playlists entirely. You could even dynamically award more loot to passages that are low populations on a weekly basis. If there weren't enough easy targets last week, then maybe make the hardcore ticket give out double rewards to encourage people to take the hardcore playlist and then play against people who are harder than them, which means that the people who are in the easy playlist would have more targets to shoot from. There's so many different ways that all of these problems can be addressed. We have the technology to solve this problem. It just comes down to whether or not the community is willing to have a calm discussion where they consider all the options other than just yelling at high or low skill players. And it depends on whether or not Bungie is willing to actually sit down and make big mechanical changes to their game. I don't know how much this would take. Obviously, they need to figure it out. But I think that this is the solution. They have proven that they can do multiple different types of matchmaking at the same time. As far as I understand, currently, Trials is connection-based and card-based at the same time. I don't see why you can't have the same thing in regular Crucible. Instead of it being connection and card, it would be multiple cards. You know what I mean? It seems to me like they've already demonstrated that it's possible. They just need to implement it. This was an idea that, I've been thinking about for a long time. Like I said, I know this topic is kind of old, but, I haven't found the will to make a video in a long time. But this wasn't an idea that I had seen anywhere else, and I think it's really important that people consider alternate solutions to these problems. If you like this idea, if you think the idea of a Crucible boon that modifies your Crucible experience is a good idea, say something about it to people that who play the game. Maybe show them this video, or maybe take the idea for yourself and post it on Reddit. It doesn't it doesn't really matter that much. Just restart this conversation, but restart it with a more productive viewpoint. That's the goal. That's the goal here. I just wanted to kind of get my thoughts out there, but talk about the topic in a way that is as objective and realistic as possible, and in a way that is productive. I like to complain about things, but I don't like to complain about things that I don't know how to fix. That seems disingenuous. So, I guess I've said my piece. If you like the ideas that I was talking about, go ahead and tell people, share this concept with them. If you like this kind of format, then I guess subscribe, stick around. I'm gonna try and do. The goal is to do some videos like this and do other videos that are more that are less targeted and more just casual. I kind of just make whatever I feel like. There's also no upload schedule. I was gonna do 1 video a week, but like apparently I cannot do that. Yeah. If you made it all the way to the end, thanks for watching.